Hello and welcome everyone. Today we are going to use Choreo to develop an end-to-end use case that touch upon data that's stored in Salesforce and also use that to send some notifications through Slack. And here this is the scenario, the landscape we are going to look at. Our data about customers are stored in Snowflake, and then campaign about data sales campaign about data are stored in Salesforce. And here we are assuming we are doing campaigns targeting specific customers, and then we want to get a summary view of that and then send notifications to Slack. So I've created some trial accounts in all of these systems. So first of all, I've created a trial account in Snowflake and using the Snowflake sample data that's available already. And then I'm using specifically the customer table to get customer information. You have pre-populated data about customers, about customer ID, and then there are some details, email addresses, etc. So we'll be using this data set as our storage data. And then in Salesforce, I've created a trial account as well, a developer trial account. And then I've created a single campaign just for the sake of simplicity. And then we are going to use this to get campaign data, and then use Slack to send a message about the campaign summary. So the architecture we are going to look at looks something like this. So first of all, we have our storage, which is in Snowflake, and we'll be creating a API for this. You can consider it as a CRUD API, but in this example, we'll be just reading data. And then here we are going to use the Snowflake connector that's built into Choreo. And then we are going to create a REST API, another REST API that is going to use the data API that we just created. And then based on the response, based on the email address of users that we get, use the Salesforce connector to get corresponding campaign data, and then aggregate that, and then of course create what we call an experience API, wrap that in experience API, get campaign data, and then send a notification through Slack. An alternative to this API, REST API, we are going to look at also creating a GraphQL API, and similarly using the existing CRUD API we created to get Snowflake data, and then using the Salesforce connector in a GraphQL service, and then expose that as a reusable service as well. So if you have a scenario where you want to use GraphQL to get data, you can. So I'm going to skip some of the introductory material about Choreo and then components and being able to do collaborative development and so on. There are other such intro videos that's available. I encourage you to look at those and then get a view of what are the overall features that we have. In this video, we are straight away going to use the REST API functionality and then create services and then implement our scenario. Let's go and create our first API, which is going to be this CRUD API that is going to talk to Snowflake and then expose that data. So I'm going to create a REST API here, and then here you can have we have a couple of options. You can start a repo or a project from scratch, or if you have an existing GitHub repo with services, you can connect that GitHub repo and then being able and use the features that's built in to Choreo on your existing code. And then you can also see there's an option to bring your own Docker file, and then it's coming soon. So here in this example, we are going to create a API from scratch, and I'm going to name this as Snowflake data. and then I'm going to just keep this as accept the defaults, and it's a Choreo managed repo, and then click on create. So this is a step that's going to take a couple of seconds, and then you can see we are provisioning a GitHub repo for the project, and also creating a CI/CD pipeline specifically for that project, and then integrate the GitHub repo that got just created, and then provision that. And then once this gets created, it's gonna bring us to a overview page about the project, and then visualize the project in a sequence diagrammatic form. And then here you can see we have using this develop section to develop the program, and then we'll see the deployment, testing, and manage and observe functionality as we go along. So I'm going to click on edit code here, which is going to do a git clone of the project that got created, and then open up the Visual Studio Code editor in a temporary workspace. So you have a familiar development experience when you are working with APIs and services. So here a couple of things to note. So this is you can see it has the get keyword, meaning that it's a REST service, and then our the resource name is greeting here. This is the sample skeleton that gets created for every when you create a REST service. So it's a fully contained REST service. So you can run this, and then it'll be like a very similar to a echo service. Whatever you give as input, it'll return you back. And then you can see the files that gets created. Dependencies.toml file track dependencies for the project, and then service.bal is where all our main source code lies, and then you can configure ballerina options in the ballerina toml file. Here let's open up this source view, and then which is going to open up the ballerina program for the project that got created. And you can see it's a simple greeting service which accepts a parameter, and this will become a query parameter in the REST service. And then if its name is it's empty, it's throwing an error saying the name should not be empty. And then if there's a name, it's gonna return hello name. So here we'll rename this greeting resource to say, let's say, get data. And then when we are working with the source code, you can see sort of the graphical view gets updated as well. Let's remove all of this. We don't need this stuff. And then we'll use a Snowflake connector. So I'm going to use the graphical view to create that. Click on connector. Once a connector list is loaded, we're going to search for Snowflake, and then use the Snowflake connector here. And it's going to pull this dependency right now into our project, and then provision that connector. So once it pulls up, it asks the credentials that needed to connect to Snowflake. Here it accepts an account identifier, user, and a password. So for the account identifier, we'll since it's not changing, I'm gonna basically hard code this value. You can also create what we call configurables, and we'll look at how we create configurables when we are working with the username and password. I'm going to copy paste the Snowflake instance or the account identifier here. Let me copy that, and then I'm going to edit here and then paste it. And then username, I'm going to create what you call the configurable. So configurable is a way that's built into Ballerina and also Choreo to make sure we are not dealing with credentials. So we don't have to hard code credentials in the source code itself, but have a way of externally injecting these values at runtime. So create configurable. I'm going to name it as Snowflake user. Click on add, and the password also create a configurable. Snowflake password, and then click on save. And then once we add the connector, you can see we create a configurable value for username and password, and then it has a client with the constructor. And then also you can see it added 2 import statements. That's basically the connector that we need to import these packages when you are working with the Snowflake connector. And now we are going to do and execute an action on the connector. So Snowflake endpoint, and then do a query. And this is where we have to insert our the Snowflake query to get data. I also have a sample query. Let me also copy that query, which is what I'm going to do here is that since the customer table has lots of rows, I'm going to do a reduced count rows. So can edit the query here. Or let's, okay, can also save and then update in the source as well, which is going to do the same thing. So my query is basically, I'm selecting all the columns from sample data and then customer table and ordering by customer ID. And then I'm getting like the 10 rows of that. And then we get what you call this query response from Snowflake, and it created this what you call the data stream to get data from a response. And this is another way that's built in to Ballerina, where when we read a data set, it doesn't read everything into the memory, but we have a way of streaming that data so that we can read whatever we want and then work with a subset of data that we are interested in, and then continuously read until we reach the end of the stream. So now we got a stream, and then it's accepting this generic record structure, which is going to represent a JSON payload. And then also an optional error. So question mark is built into Ballerina as a way of indicating that this can be an error, or it can be also like a null value. So error, an optional error in this case. Right. So once we have that, we can also look at the shape of the data that we get to make sure we are getting the right data. So for this, what we can do is we can print it to the console and then check it out. So what I'm going to do now here is that we can iterate through a query expression that's built into Ballerina. So the syntax for that is say from, let's say same record structure, we in query response, and let's do a do here, then print the data that we get into the standard output. Println v dot let's say to JSON string, and then it says IO is not defined, so we need to import that module, Ballerina IO, and then we can start running this program, and then here this can potentially throw an error. So we need to use a check keyword here, which will, if there's any error, it'll throw up the stack here. And then we have a return here. We'll change this to say it'll return an optional error for the time being, and then close the statement with a semicolon. And then we can try out this service. So we'll click on run, which is going to compile this program and then run. And here at this time, it'll ask what's the credentials for the configurable variables. So let me give that info. So my username for Snowflake is ch, and then I have the password here, and then click on run. And then it's going to compile and then print a line saying running executable. Then we know, okay, the program is now running, and then we'll click on test and then try out what it prints. So it's running executable, and then we can try it out, which is going to open, since this is REST API, even though we didn't explicitly create a REST API, it creates a full REST API skeleton with OpenAPI try it UI built in, and then we can click on get, and then it's try it out. So here we didn't change the parameter, so we'll just for the time being send some dummy value. Right. So this now throws an error saying error while executing the query. We need to use select an active warehouse, and then that's what we need to do. So we'll click on, we'll press Ctrl C here to quit this, and then make that change. So in order to provide that input, so we need what we call this Snowflake options structure. So if you type Snowflake here, and then there are a set of options here, an option structure, I think let's name it as Snowflake options, and then you can click on, you can press Control Space, which is going to give you what are the parameters that we need here, and then we need properties. We need to use properties here, and before doing that, we also need this request generated key to be set to none, which is going to be Snowflake options, and then none. And then we'll use properties. So this is going to take a JSON key value pair. So we're going to say warehouse is the warehouse name, which is going to be, in my case, it's named as my warehouse. And then once we are done with this, we need to give that when we create the connector. So username, password here, account identifier, username, password, and then we can say Snowflake options. It needs the field name as well, so we'll use options and Snowflake options. So now we'll run it again, and the values are not changing. So click on run, which is going to compile and then run. So we'll wait for that running executable line here, and then we'll use a try it and then try it out. So it's running. We'll switch to try it and then click on execute. Yeah, so this can take, depending on the connection parameters, etc., and time can vary. Here, you did see a couple of seconds taking for the query, and we see set of 10 rows that we get from Snowflake. So now we know the shape of the data. We can continue our program logic. So here, what we're going to do now is extract the exact three attributes: the first name, email address, and birth country. So even though you have the option of using the record structure, we have a better way in Ballerina where you can define a type and then work with the type, so it becomes much more easy to deal with. And I'm going to define two types here, but the first type, we'll use it to represent the incoming payload. So we'll define a type called in customer, and this is a record type. And we'll add three attributes: string c underscore first name. So this is the same as the column name that's there in that's there in our Snowflake data. So which is c underscore customer first name, c underscore first name. And also we need email address, which is going to be c underscore email address, and then the country, so which is going to be c underscore birth country. So let's do that, and then string c underscore email address, and string c underscore birth country. So sometimes this based on the data set, the column values can be empty. So we are going to indicate that here by using this question mark, saying this value can also have a valid string and also can be an empty string as well. So once we have that, we can what we can do is we can change this type from a record type to directly the type we define in customer, and then we can also say this type is also in customer, and then we can simply try out the service and see what we get, which is we are going to get the same set of data. And here we've indicated by default this is what we call an open structure, which means that we can work with the values that we are interested in, but at the same time, if the input contains additional fields, just like in our example, those fields will be added here as well. If you can also work with what you call closed structures, so you can indicate using two pipe symbols here. And then what it means is that this structure is closed, so that you have to, if there are additional fields, or if there are, you have to define all the fields that you get, otherwise it will going to throw an error. So in this case, we are going to work with like open structure. And now we are going to define a new structure. So that's the structure that we are going to send it back as a response of this service. So I'm going to define a new structure called customer record, and then I'm going to define the same name. This time I'm going to change the fields of this string email, and then optional string country. Right. So here we have our check do statement from statement. So here let's assign this to a customer array. So the data type we just defined, customer array, customers, and then we'll say it's an empty array for the time being. And then we can assign the incoming values of incoming payload to this customer. So here what we're going to do is that we're going to use customer, and then we're going to use the push customers dot push. We're just going to push new customer values to the array, and then it's going to be a JSON structure that we are pushing, and then it has 3 parameters: name, email, and country. So our incoming value is that it's going to be same as C underscore first name, and email again v dot C underscore email, and country gonna say v underscore v dot C underscore birth country. And then, yeah, so now we pushed the new values in a new shape to the customer, and then we can also use a return statement to return that return customers. And of course, we need to change the return type here to say we are returning a customer array, one optional error. And also I want to so we can of course check this out before we are moving forward. So we click on run again. So before this, let's cancel this and then change our input as well to don't accept an input. Let's remove the document and then let's click on run. So no change to the credentials. And then in a second it will compile and then say, okay, it's running. So we can try it out. Let's see, unused module. Okay, we have an error saying unused module prefix IO. So we are not printing it anymore. So we'll remove the import statement and then click on run again. Click run. And this is the usual development cycle. You develop something, and then if there's an error, you will get a compile error, and then you correct it, and then run it again. And then now it's running. So we'll use the same Swagger data. So let's click on try it. So it'll open up the new one with the correct without removing that input parameter. So try it and then click on execute. And then we're going to get this structure, right? So this is the name, email, and country, just as we define in that new data type. And then we get 10 customers from Snowflake. So here I'm going to, before we move further, we are going to make an additional change, which is going to, right now, if you notice, the country field is getting all caps. So we're going to change this to title case, and then there are countries with multiple words as well. So we'll change it to title case. So we can do that by attaching a function on this birth country field to make all caps title case. So let's define a function here. So in this service definition itself, I'm going to say it's a function and title case, and we are going to accept an optional string, can be empty, and it's returning a string from this. And then let's say if words is a string, so we'll check the error condition. We'll do our title case conversion. So else we'll just return like the empty string. So now we have a set of words. So we need a way to split it. So if you go to ballerina.io and look at the API docs. There's a package called regex, which has a split method. We can split a string. So click on regex, and yeah, we'll use this split method. So this is yeah, split. So it's gonna take like a string and then a separator, and then it's gonna return like a string array as a result. So we'll use the same method here. So it's returning a string array of words, and then we'll use regex dot split, and it's going to take words. This is the incoming sentence or the string, and then we'll use space as a separator. So since we use this package, we need to import it. Import regex, ballerina regex. Right. Now we'll loop through the words, and then we'll make them. We'll use the first. We'll skip the first letter, and then we'll take the rest of the letters and then make it lowercase. So we'll use the while loop. While we'll use the index here. We'll use a while loop. I is less than w dot length, and then we'll take each word w I, take this word, and then we'll do a concatenation. So there are multiple ways of doing this. I'll do it this way with this one. So we'll take this first character, and then we'll use the substring. So substring. So it has a start index and a end index, right? So start index will start from 1, and end index is s dot length. And then we'll make this lowercase. So once we have that, dot to low ASCII. And then we'll go to the next word, plus equals 1. And then, yeah, the rest is, and then we'll return this one, return. And then we have, what we have is like an array. In Ballerina, we have a way of what you call destructuring an array, which is going to be necessary to our next function. So here, let's look at the string module. String module has a join function. So search for string. It has a join function, join 0 or more strings together with a separator. Join, yeah. So string, it accepts a separator and 1 or more strings. Since we have an array, we have to convert that to essentially like a list. So in Ballerina, we have this sort of a destructuring or array to list operator. So we'll use that. So string join, and then the separator is a space, and then the list operator is 3 dots, and then our set of words. And then we'll use this function to convert to title case here. Title case. And then we can run and then check out the results. It's the same. We'll wait for the running executable command, and then we'll click on the Swagger UI, and then try it out, and execute. And now we can see the title case function being applied to transform that field from all caps to title case. So now we are happy with the service. Now what we have to do is we'll commit our changes to the repo. So for that we have to go to the source control tab, give a message, say initial commit, and then commit it. So here another feature that's built into Choreo is that being able to prevent the developer from committing broken or code that breaks a build. So we are doing a build before we do the commit. So let's simulate like a build failure scenario. So if we use import ballerina IO, we are not using it. So if you run this, we should get a compilation error saying that so there's an unused import. So compile error, unused module prefix IO. So if we start to let's try committing this code. So give a commit message, and then click on commit. Stage all commits and then commit yes. So you can see we are running a build. That's why it's taking a couple of seconds here in order to commit a change. And then we are given this view, right? So there's a problem with compiling code. You can click on the git log, which is gonna say, okay, this is our git log, and in the build, sure, we see the build error. There's unused module prefix error, so you can't commit code that has build failures. So we'll remove this, and then use that same message to commit, and it's going to do the build again, and then commit to a source repo. So once the changes are committed, you can see now there's this sync with Choreo upstream, meaning that our local git clone is not up to date with the upstream changes. So we need to push our changes because it's a temp workspace. So we'll click on push changes. Yeah, it asks, do we need to periodically run git fetch? Click yes. And then now we are synced with the upstream repo. So now we can go to that overview sort of tab, and then if you refresh in this view, we can see our changes being applied here. Now we are using the Snowflake connector to get data, and so now we also did the development testing, and now we are going to deploy this to an environment. So you can go to deploy tab, and then click on configure and deploy. And here you can see there's two different environments already configured for you. You have the option of adding more environments, bringing also option of bringing your own in the terms of Choreo, we call it as private data plane. If you have a Kubernetes cluster in your own data center, that can be on AKS, EKS, etc. You can bring and then plug your own environment here as well. So at the build time, before deploying the changes to the build environment, it asks again the Snowflake username and password, because we've made those as configurable values. And also this is important step here. So at the deployment time, this is getting injected into the the runtime. So we'll see how this is going to be deployed. And let me copy paste my credentials. Snowflake user, and then the password. And at the deployment time, this is going to do several steps. That's based on the pipeline that gets provisioned when we create the project. So we're going to run some initial setting up tasks, and then selecting the correct environment, and then passing the config files, and then you can see we are doing the build again, checking out the code and doing the build again, and then creating a container out of this, and then pushing that container into a container registry. So build image and push, and then it's going to take that image that was pushed into the registry and then deploy into a Kubernetes cluster. So once the image is built in the deployment tab, you can see the progress of committing changes, and then doing the deployment into a Kubernetes cluster. And then once the container is deployed, we'll wait a couple of seconds until the health check URL is healthy, and then it'll show the deployment is active here. So right now it's progressing. Yeah. So once we make the health check, this will display this is now the deployment is active here. And another cool thing that's built into the platform is that this once the service gets deployed into the development environment, it gets fully exposed as a RESTful service with the same security you will have in the production environment. So the experience of testing the service is basically the same in the development environment and also the production environment. Once the deployment is active, we can click on test, and then you can see there's a security header. We can get a test key. It's already generated for us. Click on get data, and then try it out. Click on execute, and then we can see the response from the development environment is successful. So once we are happy with this, we can go to deploy, and then promote this to the production environment. So here in the production environment, you can give different set of credentials if you want. Typically, that is the case for actual services where in development environment you are talking to development endpoints and then using the credentials on those environments, and in production environments the credentials are completely different, and you're dealing with production data. So we can choose if you want, but in my case I can see I use the same development configurations, and then click on next, and this will ask us to review the credentials. So we are happy with this, and then click on promote. So all the credentials at this time are getting created as Kubernetes secrets and then injected into the running pod. So the deployment is completely on Kubernetes, and then we are using the best practices on security there to inject keys that generated as secrets. Another important factor here is that if you have your own private data plane here, private Kubernetes cluster, it will use and then it will use the same mechanism of creating the secrets and then injecting those into your running environment. So the control plane will not store any credentials that's sensitive. That's specific to that deployment. All the credentials will be stored in the private data plane. And then once the deployment is active, so we'll click on test again, and then click on data, and it also generated a test key automatically, and then we can try it out and then execute, and then we can do some smoke testing on the production environment as well to see, okay, it's giving the response we want. So once we're happy with development environment testing, promote to production, happy with the production environment testing, we can click on manage. And this is where you would do full lifecycle management of the API that we just created. And then in the overview section, we can see two different endpoints for development and prod. And then lifecycle state is now at created states. So we don't have any consumers consuming it. And the service is automatically secured with auth. We can also control rate limiting policies here, and also usage plan. So I'll click on lifecycle, and then right now it's at the created stage, which means that it's like a private service now. No one can see it externally. So we'll publish this API. So when you click publish, it asks whether we need to publish a connector. So this is another important feature that's built into the platform, where you can publish a connector. Just like we use a Snowflake connector from the connector store, we can have a way of publishing connectors for the services that we built, so that you have a way of reusing services within your organization, within that organization that created in Choreo, or as well as publicly. So if I say, yes, I want to publish a connector, it asks whether we want the connector to be private or public. So if we choose private, which is the default, it's gonna be visible within our organization or to all the developers within our organization that are working in the project. Or if you click on public, it's accessible to pretty much anyone. So we'll keep this as private for the time being, and then publish a connector. So it's going to publish that API and also publish that connector so that we can find out what are the available services from our connector store, and then being able to reuse that service. So we'll use that to create our next service, which is going to use this as a connector, which gives us data from Snowflake, and then use the Salesforce connector to create and then publish an API for Salesforce. Now that the connector is published, we can also view it in the marketplace, and the marketplace has this public private split. So this is our connector that we published, and then if there's any API documentation, you can check on the API documentation. Right now we don't have we didn't attach any documentation. So we'll click on the marketplace link, and then this is the marketplace that we have. So I have several connectors that I've published, which is private to my organization, and of course the public set of connectors. We have about probably now closer to 500 connectors that integrate with different SaaS and on-prem systems. So we can continue with our service building the next service. Before we move into that, I also want to show one thing, which is the statistics that gets exposed. So if you click on the observe tab on the left hand side, you can see the observability statistics on it, throughput per second, success and error rates, and also latency numbers when you're calling the external connectors. Another cool thing here is that the view that you get to understand observability is basically the same view that you get when you are building the service. So from a like a cognitive overhead point of view, you don't have to look at another set of screens, another set of metrics, and trying to visualize, okay, how your service function based on maybe different traces, different metrics. This is and it visualizes latency numbers. If you have multiple connectors, it will say latency numbers for each such connector usage. And also in this section, you can see what's the version of the service we are looking at. This is like the development level service. You can also switch to production and then get production latency numbers as well, depending on the service function or REST resource. You can choose what numbers you want to visualize here, and then of course you can, based on the time scale, you can also choose the time scale and then get a view of that data. So we'll continue with our example. So the next step is basically, so we build this connector, the API. So next up is we are building this Salesforce REST API. We'll use the existing API we just created to get data from Snowflake, and then use the Salesforce connector. So we'll click on create, and then REST API. Start from scratch. Let's say Salesforce data, and then click on create, which is same as before. It's just going to create a new project with a pipeline on its own, a Git repo on its own, and then it will open up that overview page with the hello world skeleton example. So while this is happening, I think another important aspect that I want to highlight here is that even though this is a SaaS based solution, you are not at all tied to a specific, or there's no lock-in as such. You can basically get any program that you create and then run it completely offline as well. So we can test that out behavior. So before we move into this project, so let's also go to the previous project that we created. And then we'll click on develop edit code. And then we'll get the view of the source code. Yeah. So let's try to run this completely offline as well. So I have a terminal here. So let's create, have ballerina here as well. So let's create a new project. New Snowflake sample. So this is going to create a new ballerina project. And then we'll open up using VS Code. Let me move that over. Yeah, so we have an empty skeleton project, right? So this is like a simple hello world that gets generated. You can also run this here. So bell run, and this will output saying hello world. Yeah, so we'll switch to the browser, and then let's copy this and then straight away paste it here. And then of course we need the connector, right? And then also we need the credentials. So for credentials, when running offline mode, we need to provide we call config toml. So we can create this config.toml, and then we can name it as the same variable, Snowflake pass and Snowflake user. So I'll just copy the same values. So here we are using a config file to pass these variables. And then let me get my password. Let me copy that and then paste it password field, and then save this file and then switch to our main program. So here, what can you do first before running it? We can do a build, which is going to basically get the connector into a local project, right? Because we don't have the connector, we just had an empty project. I think should be bell pull, or we can say bell run, which is going to pull the connector anyway. So let's see. Unused config value. I think we need to give the organization or the the module name here. Let's say module name is Snowflake sample, and let's try it out. Unused configuration value. Let's see. Let's try again by saving the changes here, and then I'll run. Yeah, maybe we need forgot to do the saving there. So values are the same. Okay. And then now you can see it pulls the connect information from the central repo, ballerina central.ballerina.io. And then it says running executable, right? And then the values it's getting from the config.toml file, which is the same. So the thing I forgot to do was save here. I was thinking the autosave was enabled on VS Code, but once I save the file, it worked okay. So here we can now, since the service is running, we can check out the response. So here, if we go to, let's say, we can also choose the browser to check that out. HTTP localhost 9000, and then the port, 1990, and the function is get data. So 9090 get data, and you can see the response is basically the same. So if we try to format this a bit nicer, copy to VS Code, and then make it as JSON, and then format it. You can see the same response that we got from Choreo console. You can get it locally as well. So we didn't do any changes to the program as such. So the only change we did is basically create this config.toml file and then provide the credentials. And this, so of course, we have multiple ways of providing the credentials. You can use it through a config file, or you can in the ballerina command line, you can provide that as a value as well. So the platform is really not blocking you, not locking you into a certain model. If you want, you can host this almost all the programs that you create with Choreo completely offline as well, and get the same exact response. So let's move on with our Salesforce sample. So let's close this. Components, Salesforce data. Click on develop, click on edit code. Right. So now let me open up the source view. So let me remove this, the comment, and I'm going to change here. I'm going to say, let's say, I want to say get summary, summary of the campaigns. We don't need an input here. And then, yeah, we'll remove this part as well. And now first step is to use our connector that we just published, right? So connector, use the connector, and then in the marketplace also you can see this is the connector that we just published, Snowflake data. You can search by that as well, and then get the connector. So let's search by that. And then this is the connector we just published. Click on that. And it's going to pull the package. And this is asking a client ID and a client secret. So this is, since it's a public API and this is getting secured with auth, we need to provide the client ID and client secret. So how you do that is that we need to go to the developer portal. So once you go to the developer portal, you will be able to see the published APIs. I have a bunch of APIs that I've already published. And then Snowflake data is the one that we just published. So here I'm going to click on the applications tab, and this is basically your standard API management functions that's integrated into Choreo. I'm going to click on create. I'm going to say my integrated app, and then you can see there's a throttling tier as well for this, and then I'm going to click on create. And then I'm going to go to subscriptions and add an API. I'm going to add the Snowflake data API, the last one. Click on add, and then I'm going to click on production keys, generate credentials, and it generated a consumer key and a consumer secret. So we'll use this consumer key and secret to access this, and then we'll create configurable variables, so we don't have to hard code the credentials. I'll say Snowflake client ID, and then again for the secret, Snowflake secret, and click on add, and rest of it is fine. I click on save, and then adds the connector. So at this stage, we can, without doing anything else, we can check whether we can get data from our connector. So we can do that by clicking here on the graphical view, click on action, Snowflake data, get data, and just click save. And it gets a customer array, which is coming from the Snowflake data that gets imported as our connector. And we'll can return that as well straight away. We can also, let's say we are not returning anything, an optional error, and then we'll log it to the console. So IO println, and then I get data response to a JSON string. Then let's import ballerina IO. So the cool thing about being able to run the same program offline is that you can make, you can do the other way as well. You can, if you want, you can choose to create and test your programs offline and then just paste it in here and then commit and then go from there. Or if you are working in offline mode, if you are working with a GitHub repo and you can connect the same GitHub repo to Choreo, and then get the same updates, and then do the deployment, and then continue your flow there as well. So we'll click on run, and then we can ask the client ID and client secret, and then we need to go to the developer portal, and then client consumer key goes into client ID, and consumer secret goes to secret. Click on run, which is going to compile our program, and then run. Once it's running, we can click on try it, and then try this out. Try it. Summary, try it out, execute. Here. And then we can see our response that we get from that API that we just created, right? So we are invoking this, we are reusing that API in another service. Okay, so let's continue. So this is all good. So Control C, go back to, you can also close the UI of it. We can go to our main program and then continue, right? So next one is basically we can use our Salesforce API. Let's use that. So let me get the console out of the way. Let's use the Salesforce connector. So connector, look for Salesforce. Let's wait until the connector list is loaded. Yeah, Salesforce connector. And here out of these connectors, we are going to use a Salesforce REST API, which is going to pull the package just similar to any other connector. And then we need to provide several of the credentials, right? So base URL, refresh URL, refresh token, client ID, and client secret. This you can you have to get using your Salesforce instance. And how to obtain those if you are just trying out, and that's your first time working with Salesforce, can be a bit tedious. So there is a blog post by Pramod there, which outlines how you can create an app in Salesforce and obtain the necessary credentials, and then and also including the Salesforce scopes required to be able to call the API. So I'll include this in the description, so you can click and then follow this guide. So basically very straightforward and easy to follow guide, and this is the guide that I used to create these tokens. So let's get back in my base URL. This is your specific Salesforce instance URL, and then in my case it's going to be, we copy that. I'm gonna hard code this because it's not changing in this scenario. You can also create configurable values and then point to different Salesforce instances. So the refresh URL is, let's copy that as well. Refresh URL. I'm going to hard code the refresh URL, and then refresh token, client ID, client secret. We need the configurable values. So we'll create Salesforce refresh token, client ID, Salesforce client ID, and then secret. click on add, and then this is fine. Click on save, and this is going to create the Salesforce connector and also the configurable values. So at this stage, we can basically see our Salesforce connector is working. So likewise, you can check step by step, or you can integrate and then test at the last step as well. So I'll in this case, I'll test it. So click on this, and then yeah, before the IO call, we'll test the Salesforce. Click on the action, Salesforce endpoint, and in this case, what we want is a query. Get query results. Click on save. Yeah, get a query, and then we need to pass the Salesforce query. So let me get that query from my notes. So let me paste that. So this is basically getting the campaign data. So campaign data, we need to pass an email address because we are getting the first results. So since I have one campaign, I'm going to get the first email of the result set I get from Snowflake, and that's the email ID that I've used to create the campaign. But here you can iterate and then create extract email and then call Salesforce for each email address as well. So let me get the email of the customer. So get data response. I'm going to get the first result, and then we need the email, and then toString, and then close the query. Right, and then we can iterate and print here as well. So let's do that. So we can use the same check. The query expression, the from result set from the variable, and then like the do, use a do block to execute an action. So we can say from record. Record is the same v in query response, and then we'll do the do action here. We can say IO println to JSON string, and see what we get. And then this returns an error. So we'll use check to just return that error back to the caller. And then we can check it out. So we imported IO. So click on run. And now we need to provide the Salesforce credentials, right? Because we are testing the Salesforce connector. So we'll give that. So Salesforce secret. So let me copy those values. Secret would be the client secret. Client ID, Salesforce client ID. Salesforce refresh token. And then click on run. So this is basically to see test of the connector and then see the shape of the data that we get. So now it's running. Click on try it. Try it out. Click on execute. And then we get a response, like a JSON response like this, right? So we start date, expected revenue, actual cost, end date, and also the email address that got from the response that we get from our connector from that's reading Snowflake data. And then I'm going to copy this and then showcase another feature in Ballerina. So here we get a JSON response. So we need like a type to work with, so that it's easy to work with in the language, right? So we can, here we have a quick shortcut in the editor that's built in. So you can paste this JSON message, right? And then select it. And then you can say go to command palette. And then in Ballerina plugin, there's a function called the feature called paste JSON as record. So once you click on it, it asks give access to the clipboard, say allow, and then what it's going to do is convert that JSON response message to a Ballerina record structure, and it identifies the types in this case. So we can just rename it as what we want, whatever we want. So we'll rename it as our campaign summary, and you can also do any changes if you want here. So here, let me convert this to, say, it accepts float values instead of decimals. And now we can work with this record type, right? So which is very convenient to be able to work with structures, like a full-on data type. And then instead of this record type, now we can directly say campaign summary. And also here in the record also we can say we want to get like a campaign summary, which we can. Also, I want to show another feature that's in Ballerina. So you can differ how you want to convert, or how, or where, or when you want to use types, and use types necessary for use cases where you want to get data like a field access in the JSON record. So let me keep the record structure in here, and then create a new variable called campaign summary. And then instead of this, I can say assign to summary. And then I can say, okay, this is a generic record structure, and use this clone with type method. Let's say campaign summary. So this can potentially return an error. So we'll use the check keyword here. And this is going to preserve the type and then create a typed variable. And now we can return this. And we need to change the error type to accept campaign summary, or an optional error. Oops. Let me say campaign summary, and then campaign summary or an optional error. And now we can test this as well. So question mark, sorry, the semicolon to close a statement. So we can test this integration now. Run. We should give us the same output, right? So unused module prefix. So we'll remove that now. We are not using it anymore. And it asks us credentials. They are the same. Click run. Yeah, it's running. So we can click on try it and then test it out. Get summary, try it out, execute. And now we get the response we are looking for, right? So now we created the Salesforce API, which is basically, if we go back to our diagram, So this portion, so we completed this one by reusing the connector we published. And then now at this stage, we can publish a connector, connector and an API for this as well, so that we can reuse it from our experience API. We are going to create to push this response to Slack. So we're happy with this. Close it and then go to the source control tab, and then give a message and then commit it. Which is going to do a build and then commit. So you can see it's taking a couple of seconds here. And then once the changes are committed, let's push it to our upstream repo as well. Yeah, once the changes are pushed, then we can go back to the overview section and then click on refresh to see whether we see our commit. And sure, we see the commit, and then we can see, okay, the changes we did. And then you can see the diagram essentially gives like a sequence diagrammatic view of our integration, right? So get data from the Snowflake data API that we just created, and then using the Salesforce endpoint, and then sending a summary back. So let's click on deploy. And then we'll deploy this to a development environment and then test it out. And also deploy this to production and test it out, and then publish a managed API and a connector for this. So let's click on deploy, configure and deploy, which is going to ask us all the credentials that we have to provide, right? So here let's first provide Snowflake client ID and client secret, which is from our developer portal. Consumer key as client ID. Consumer secret goes into the secret, and then our Salesforce credentials. Let me copy these values. Refresh token. Go to the refresh token and then Salesforce client ID. Client ID and then Salesforce secret. And then click on deploy. Which is going to build again the Docker images out of it. Do the first of all do the build, and then first of all check out the project and then build it, and then create the Docker container out of it. Create all the secrets as config maps, and then inject into the Kubernetes cluster, and then pull that image and then run that in the development Kubernetes cluster. Right. So we'll wait a couple of seconds until the build is or the deployment is ready. So once that's done, we'll do the development testing, development environment testing, to make sure everything is working as expected, and then promote it to the production environment, and also do a test, and then move on to our next function. All right, once it's active, let's go into test. So automatically test keys are generated for us. Click on get summary, try it out. And then we see, okay, the expected output is there. So we'll go to our deploy tab and then promote the deployment code to production. So use a development configuration, and so no change in the config values. We'll use the same values and then click on promote. Once the deployment is complete, we'll also do a test here in the production environment just to make sure. So try it out, execute. Yeah, so we just see the same response. So it's good to go now. So we'll click on manage and then go to lifecycle and then publish this, right? So, and then yes, we also need to publish a connector. Keep on the private. Let's keep it private as it is. And then click on publish connector to publish a connector. Once the connector is published, we can go to the other function, in the sense we'll create the final integration, which is gonna create another API that we call it as the experience API. So it can be customized experience based on the business requirement. Basically get reuse services, in this case the Salesforce connector, and then get data and then create a message and then send it to Slack as a notification. And then later on we'll check out the function of creating an alternate view for a REST API. So once it's published, now before reusing, we need to add a subscription, because we are going to use the connect. In order to use the connector, it needs a client ID and client secret. So we can do that by going to the developer portal and then add another subscription for the same API. So add API, and then our API is Salesforce data. So this is the API that we just created, and that we add a subscription for that, so that we can use the same set of consumer key secret to access that service as well. So let's click on the set of components and then click on our next service, create from scratch, and then give a name. Say let's say Slack notification, and then create. So let's switch back to our one while this is getting created. So we will switch back to our diagram. So this is the API that we are going to create, and it's a REST API. So the trigger part is should be done manually. So for testing this, we'll invoke the REST API endpoint, and then you can also choose the experience, how you want to get this triggered. So maybe an application call in the REST API, or maybe there's the trigger that gets triggered at scheduled intervals, maybe twice weekly or something like that, and then invoke the API and then send the message to Slack. So that experience is configurable depending on how you want to go about it. You can design it, and you have the flexibility of designing that. So once it's created, let's click on edit code. And then we are going to use the connector we just created, right? That's a Salesforce API, Salesforce connector, but not the public one, but the one we just created and published. So click on connector. Wait a couple of seconds for the connectors to load. And then once it's loaded, we'll say Salesforce data, and this is the connector we just published. We'll reuse that. And asks for the client ID and client secret, right? So we just created a subscription for it. We can use the same client ID, client secret. So let's create client ID, and then we'll create a configurable value for the secret as well. Secret, right? Rest of it looks the same. Click on save, and then we'll change the resource. So we'll get rid of the document here, and then we'll say send notification, and then we'll remove the parameter, and then remove the body of it, and then we'll invoke the action on the Salesforce connector, and then this is the operation we defined earlier. Get summary, which is going to get a summary view of it, right? And the campaign, and we already have a data type that's coming from that package that gets imported. And then what we need is basically the Slack connector. So let's add that as well. Connect. Let's search for Slack. Use a Slack connector. It's going to pull the package, and then let's say what kind of a security it accepts. I think this connector only asks for a Slack user auth token. So there's a Slack token, right? So we'll create a configurable value for it. Slack token, then click on add. Rest of it is the same, so we don't have to change anything there. So we add the connector which got updated, Slack endpoint with the configurable value, and then we'll use so we had to use Slack message in order to send this send a message to Slack. So let's see, let's do an action on the Slack endpoint, and then let's search for post message. That's the one we want, and it asks message. We had to provide a channel name and the text, right? So channel name in my case is general, so we'll send it to the general channel, and then this is where we need to provide the text, right? So we can create a custom message. So let's create that. So it's string. Let's create one. So let's say campaign summary, summary for. Let's get some parameters here. So let's get summary response email. Yeah, we'll use the name. Campaign summary for this person, and then we can click on, we can continue customizing the message part, right? So let's say couple of tabs, and then let's say get summary response, maybe start date, and then start date to end date, get response. Okay, this is a campaign start date and end date. And let's say okay, let's also do on the next line, and then let's do some tabs as well, just like before. Plus, and then let's say get summary response expected revenue. So let's use that. Let's get a string called expected revenue and say get summary response expected revenue, and then yeah, we need to make it to string, and then we can use that here, string. So there's also an option to send markdown. You can format your message using markdown. So let's say true here, and then also add maybe yeah, maybe like a rocket symbol. Okay, maybe like 3 rockets or something like that. Yeah. And then what we need to do is send this. All right, so you can post a message variable, unused variable. So since we are not using this, we can use the underscore to say, okay, we are not interested in the response of it. We'll just send an error and then send the message and then forget about the response. So here let's change this to an optional error so that we don't have to return anything. And then we can test it out. We can do a development testing here. So we'll run it. So Slack token, let's say Slack token use auth token. Let's check. I'm not sure about the correct token, but let's see. I have 2 Slack tokens, but we can test it out. So the secret is coming from the connector. So let's consumer key goes to client ID, and then consumer secret goes to secret. Let's run it and see. And then we'll use this, not that, but we'll use the this one, Slack. Let's test it. Okay, I think this is the wrong token, so not allowed token type. So that's a different token. So let's let's use that other token. So click on run, and then let me copy. I think it's a user auth token that's required here. So running executable, let's test it out, see whether it works. So try it out, execute. Right, let's see what this error is about. Okay, I paused the video to check on more details on this error. So looks like at this time it seems to be some error in the version of the connector. So we can go to our API docs and then check on that as well. So right now go to central.varina.io and then check on the Slack connector. I think this is the one that's being used. And then while I think the team is fixing the issue, maybe I need to open up an issue and then attach the error I'm seeing. So until then, we can use a different version of the character and see if that improves. We can use 221. So how we can do that is, let me maximize this and then go to our code and then stop the service. And then we'll open up this dependencies.toml file, which have all the dependencies that the packages are being used, and then it tracks. You can ping, you can not ping, you can specifically bind this version of a connector when you're using the connector. So right now we'll go to the Slack connector. So this is a Slack connector and we are using the version 3.0.0. So we'll switch to the 2.1 version and see whether that improves. So let's go to a program again and then click on run. And at this time, yeah, credentials are the same. So at runtime, we should see the compiler pulling the 2.2.1 version of the package. Let's see. Okay, maybe I'll just, since I paused the video and tried it out, I think that dependency is already there. So let's we can go ahead here and then click on try it. So let's move that window and then try our try it of the service. So let's click on get, try it out, and then click on execute. And now we see once the API is executed, we see our message. So this, I think we might have missed like another colon. Yeah, the colon here then. So we can also get that. And then try one more time. Let's click on run. The credentials are the same. And then we'll try down and see whether this changes. So once this is running, let's go to our try it and then cancel, try it out, execute. And then now we see our response is being recorded or getting pushed to Slack. So now what I'm going to show you is the next part of the use case. So let's open that diagram. I think it's in the Slack window here. So this part. So let's say creating a similar API and then exposing that as a GraphQL API instead of REST API. So we already created the REST API and then use the existing data service or the data API that we created to get data from Snowflake. And then we use the Salesforce connector to do the same thing. And then look up the campaign ID by email address and then get records. So let's create a GraphQL service to do the same. So let's go back to our component view. We can also close this. Yeah, we can stop it and then we can change the changes as well here. So let's say we'll commit the changes and then push these changes. And then for this, we can also go through the same flow of creating and then deploying to dev and deploying to production. So basically the method is the same. So I'm not going to go through that again. So let's push these changes and then close this out, and then close this out as well, and go back to our components view, and then refresh it, and then we'll create a new API. Here, instead of creating a REST API, let's create a GraphQL API. Create a GraphQL API from scratch. We'll name it as Salesforce GraphQL, GQL, and then we create a repository for it. So this is the same as the 2 times before or 3 times before. We are going to create a project from scratch for this, and then we will look at creating a GraphQL API using the same connector, the existing connector that we use to get data from Salesforce, and then we will incorporate that as a GraphQL front end. So once the project is created, let's click on edit code, and then see what we get for the GraphQL skeleton project. Cool. So right now we have, you can see this is a GraphQL resource. So so if you go to the source view, we can see there's a new service on GraphQL listener. Previously this was HTTP listener. Now we have GraphQL listener, and the structure is pretty much the same. So let me remove the document for this. And then on this GraphQL service, we are defining resource functions. So this is a greeter function, just like the hello world, like the echo service that we get for HTTP services. And then let's change this to say you want to get a summary view, and then doesn't accept any return parameter, and then we can change the body, right? So here what we are going to do is first we need to use the connector for our Salesforce API, which is a REST service that we just created. So connect let's say Salesforce data, this API that we just created for Salesforce, and it requires a consumer ID and a secret. So let's create configurables for this. My SF ID, and then I'll name it as my SF secret. Okay, so we'll save it. We'll save the connector configuration, and then we need to use that to get the data out of it. So we need to use say Salesforce data endpoint get summary, right? So this gets the data as a Salesforce campaign summary. So it's should be in this package. So Salesforce data campaign summary, and then this connector invocation can throw an error. So we'll use a check expression here. If there are any errors, it'll throw up the stack. Semicolon here, and then what we have to do is represent what you call the GraphQL output objects. So to define the output objects, in Ballerina you have a concept called service classes. So service classes represent the output objects, right? So we have to define a service class here. It's a service class. It's a summary, and then all the attributes and the methods, right? So we will define private attributes here. I'll add a private keyword later. So we need start date, and we need expected revenue, and also we need an actual cost. So float. I'm looking at my notes here on all the attributes that's required, that sends by the Salesforce connector data that we just created. Actual cost, and then we need end date. It's a string end date, and then float is budgeted cost, and then we have, of course, the name, the campaign name, and we'll create as private attributes, so it's not visible outside. Okay, and then we can define the constructor when we're constructing this object. And in Ballerina terms, it's called init. So init function, and then it accepts all these parameters. So string start date. I'll copy paste these attributes. Show cost. End date. Budgeted cost, and finally the name. And then we'll assign this to the sort of the private in object-oriented terms instance variable. So in Java you have the this keyword, right? So in Ballerina we have the self keyword to refer to these variables. Start date is start date, and self expected revenue is expected revenue. Actual cost, send to actual cost. Budgeted cost, and finally the name. So once we define this, we can of course define the getters and setters for this. So in this case, we'll define, since we are just reading these values, we'll define getter methods. So it goes as we need to define a resource function, and then accessor is get, and a path becomes the name of the variable, right? So start date, and it returns string. So we'll return self dot start date. So we have 1, 2, 3 string variables. So we'll copy this resource function, and then copy it 2 times. And our next one is end date. So let's define that. End date, and then the name. And we have 2 attributes that returns float. So returns float and expected revenue, and then actual, sorry, 3. Yeah, expected revenue, actual cost, and budget cost. So expected revenue, let me copy this. Paste it 2 times. And then expected cost, actual cost. Actual cost, and then of course, finally budgeted cost. All right, so that represents our output object that maps to the GraphQL output object. And then what we should do here is that we'll just return this, the same thing, and then construct a new service class object. So return, and then say new, and this is our service, going to be our service class object, right? So s dot start date, I'll use the same order, expected revenue, actual cost, s dot end date, s dot budgeted cost, and name. Okay, and then we need to change the return type, of course, here, and then say this is type of the service class, returns a summary or an optional error. Right, and then we'll test this out. So what we'll do here is that we'll commit our changes. So we're going to, in this time, we are going to deploy this to the development environment, and then use that for testing. Check the and then once it's committed, we'll push it, and then use that to deploy it to the development environment. So once it's committed, let's push these changes. Yeah, once that's successfully pushed to upstream, so we'll refresh this to check whether we have our commit. Sure it does, and then we go to the deployment tab, and then click on config and deploy. And at this point, we need to give the key and secret for the Salesforce connector, right? So we'll give this Salesforce connector credentials. So consumer key should go to the consumer key here, and then consumer secret goes here, my SF secret, and then click on deploy. So this is gonna again go through the pipeline, and then you can see each and every project you create in Choreo, there will be a separate GitHub repo and also separate pipeline automatically attached to it. So you don't have to create any of this when you are creating an environment. If you have done this already, or if you have something inside the organization already, you probably and then if you are involved with creating such an environment, you've probably gone through the pain of figuring out the components from the cloud provider, whichever the cloud provider you use, or on-premise software components, and then tying it together, everything together, creating GitHub hooks, and then maybe using something like Jenkins for CI builds, and then incorporating like post commit hooks to automatically trigger the builds, and then also have a way of externalizing the credentials, and then educate developers on those practices. So lots of work will go into inevitably go into creating a internal platform like that. And then in Choreo, you don't have to worry about anything at all. You just provision your developer accounts and then start creating services. So let's wait until this service become healthy. So once the deployment is active, so let's click on the test button. So here, as you can see, instead of the Open API spec view, we are presented with the GraphQL, like a GraphQL playground, right? So here you can provide your GraphQL queries and then interact with the service. So here, let's see, we want to get a summary, and then we also need to provide what you call the leaf nodes, what are the attributes we need. So we'll check on some attributes. We need the name, and maybe let's try with the name first. Click on play. And then we get that data, right? And then you can change the query. Let's say we need the end date and actual cost and expected revenue. So likewise, then you can start on building your services, building your queries, and then integrate with whichever the front end sort of application. So in this video, we looked at basically creating this entire flow. So we started with creating an API, a data API that pull data from Snowflake, and then we used that and then reused that, and then created another service which incorporated that, and then based on the email, we queried Salesforce, and then we created another REST API which used the Salesforce API we created, and then based on that data pushed a summary view to a Slack channel. And also we looked at creating a GraphQL endpoint. So depending on the use case, you can choose whichever way you should go about, how you go about doing that, which services to expose, which attributes to expose. And then we of course reuse the same data API and then use a Salesforce connector to fetch the data and then expose that as a GraphQL endpoint. So that's about the video. That's about the demo I have. So hope you got something out of it. So thank you very much for watching.